Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? It was a bitterly cold evening in the winter of 1895 when I found myself once more in the familiar confines of 221B Baker Street, opposite my friend Sherlock Holmes. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls, as Holmes lounged in his chair, his sharp eyes lost in contemplation. I'd barely set down my tea when Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram, her expression one of mild alarm. Holmes took the envelope with a flicker of interest, tore it open, and scanned its contents. A slow, knowing smile crept upon his lips. "Well, Watson," he said, tossing the telegram onto the table, "it seems we have an affair of peculiar interest before us. Scotland Yard is confounded once more." I reached for the paper and read aloud. "A matter of utmost urgency. Lord Ashcombe found dead in his locked study. No sign of forced entry, yet unmistakable signs of foul play. Request your immediate assistance. Inspector Lestrade." I looked up. A locked room murder? That is indeed a rare phenomenon. "Quite so," Holmes murmured, already reaching for his coat. "Fetch your revolver, Watson. We are about to step into the heart of a most perplexing enigma." The case introduction. The hansom cab rattled through the dimly lit streets of London as Holmes and I made our way toward Lord Ashcombe's residence in Kensington. The winter fog clung to the city like a thick veil, muffling the sounds of distant carriage wheels and the occasional shout of a street vendor. Holmes sat in quiet contemplation, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze unfocused, yet intense. "You seem unusually intrigued, Holmes," I remarked. "Is it the nature of the crime, or something more?" He turned to me with a faint smile. "Both, my dear Watson. A locked-room murder is a fascinating puzzle in itself, but it is the identity of the victim that intrigues me most. Lord Ashcombe was no ordinary nobleman. He was a man of secrets." I frowned. "Secrets?" Holmes nodded. "A former diplomat, deeply entangled in matters of national security. His name has surfaced in peculiar circles, ones that prefer the shadows to the limelight. If he was murdered, then I suspect this is no mere crime of passion or robbery gone awry." The thought sent a shiver down my spine. And yet the room was locked from within? That, Watson, is precisely why this case interests me. We arrived at Ashcombe Manor, a stately home that loomed behind wrought-iron gates. A constable stood at the entrance, his breath misting in the cold air. He gave us a brisk nod before admitting us inside. Inspector Lestrade awaited in the grand foyer, his features drawn with frustration. "Thank heavens you've come, Mr. Holmes," he said, leading us through the marble hallways. "The situation is confounded beyond reason. The servants swear no one entered or left that study, and yet Lord Ashcombe lies dead within." Holmes removed his gloves methodically. "Tell me everything, Lestrade. Leave out no detail." Lestrade took a breath. "Lord Ashcombe was found an hour ago by his butler, Mr. Grayson. The door was bolted from the inside, and when we forced it open, we found his lordship slumped over his desk. Stone, dead. No sign of struggle, no apparent wounds." "No wounds at all," I interjected. Lestrade hesitated. "None visible. save for the expression on his face. It's as if he died of pure terror. Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. Now that, Lestrade, is a most fascinating detail. Take me to the body at once. With that, we followed Lestrade down the dim corridors toward the study, where the mystery of Lord Ashcombe's demise awaited us. The early investigation. Lestrade led us through the dimly lit corridors of Ashcombe Manor, the thick carpet muffling our footsteps. The air grew heavier as we neared the study, as if the walls themselves bore witness to the unnatural demise of their master. The door, now hanging slightly ajar from where it had been forced open, revealed a room steeped in an eerie silence. Holmes entered first, his sharp gaze sweeping across the scene with the precision of a surgeon. The study was lavish, yet functional. Mahogany, bookshelves lined the walls. A grand fireplace stood cold and unlit, and in the centre of the room sat an ornate wooden desk. Lord Ashcombe's body remained slumped over it, as Lestrade had described, his lifeless hand still clutching a quill. The pale glow of a gas lamp cast long, flickering shadows across his frozen expression. Watson, accustomed though he was to the sight of death, felt a peculiar unease settle over him. "Holmes!" I murmured, stepping closer. "Look at his face." Lord Ashcombe's features were twisted in unmistakable horror. His mouth hung slightly open, his wide eyes frozen in an expression of sheer dread. Holmes crouched beside the body, his fingers hovering just above the eye, man's temple, without touching him. His eyes narrowed as he examined the ashen skin, the minute details of the expression, the peculiar stiffness of the fingers. No signs of struggle, no visible wounds, and yet terror is written plainly upon his face. He muttered, "Curious, very curious indeed." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "If I may hazard a guess, it looks as though he was frightened to death." Holmes exhaled sharply. "A poetic suggestion, Lestrade, but death does not come from fear alone. There is always a cause." I watched as Holmes straightened and began his methodical sweep of the room. He moved from the bookshelves to the fireplace, pausing briefly before running his fingers along the edges of the desk. Then, with sudden intent, he crouched low, examining the Persian rug beneath the chair. "Watson, do you observe anything peculiar?" I followed his gaze, but saw nothing beyond the richly woven fabric. "I'm afraid I don't." Holmes tapped the floor gently. "The rug is misaligned ever so slightly." Lestrade scoffed. "A misplaced rug, Holmes. Surely that's no great mystery." Holmes only smiled faintly. "A misplaced rug, Lestrade, in a room where everything else is in perfect order. I would not dismiss it so quickly." With a careful tug, he peeled back the corner of the rug, revealing a series of strange dark markings upon the wooden floorboards. The shapes were faint but deliberate, like symbols etched with precision. "What in heaven's name?" I murmured, kneeling for a closer look. Holmes studied them in silence for a long moment before whispering, "This, Watson, is a language older than you or I." He turned to Lestrade with a gleam in his eyes. "Lord Ashcombe was not merely murdered. He was marked." A chill ran through me. Whatever game was afoot, it was far darker than I had imagined. First suspects and misdirection. A heavy silence hung in the study as Holmes ran his fingers lightly over the strange markings beneath the rug. Lestrade, peering over his shoulder, frowned. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" the inspector asked, shifting impatiently. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a magnifying glass, carefully studying the markings with unwavering focus. "These symbols," he murmured, "are not random scrawls, nor are they mere decorative carvings. They form a deliberate pattern, one that suggests knowledge beyond the common man's understanding." I shuddered involuntarily. "You mean some kind of secret society?" Holmes merely gave a knowing smile, but did not answer. Lestrade exhaled sharply. "I'll leave the ghost stories to you, Holmes. What I need is a solid lead. Lord Ashcombe was a well-known figure, and there must have been someone with motive enough to want him dead." Holmes rose to his feet, brushing a speck of dust from his sleeve. "And so we begin with those who had the most to gain from his demise. Who was in the house when he was found?" Lestrade consulted his notebook. "The household staff, his butler, Mr. Grayson, and 2 maids. Lord Ashcombe's nephew, Reginald Ashcombe, is also present. He was the one who summoned the authorities." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "His nephew?" Lestrade nodded. "Reginald is the sole heir to the Ashcombe estate. If anything happened to his lordship, he stands to inherit a vast fortune." "A classic motive," I remarked. Holmes gave me a half-smile. "Perhaps, Watson, but classic motives are often too convenient." Lestrade gestured toward the hallway. "Would you like to speak with him?" Holmes turned back to the markings on the floor, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "Soon. But first, I wish to examine something else." He crossed the room to Lord Ashcombe's desk and carefully picked up the quill still clenched in the dead man's hand. Then, with delicate precision, he inspected the papers beneath it. A ledger, a half-written letter, nothing immediately unusual. But when Holmes turned over the topmost sheet, he paused. "Watson, Lestrade, observe this." We stepped closer. There, faintly imprinted on the paper beneath the writing, were indentations from a previous note that had been written and removed. Holmes reached into his pocket and produced a small graphite stick, rubbing it lightly across the surface of the page. Slowly, words began to emerge. "The shadows are closing in. If I do not act soon, it will be too late. Trust no one." The message cut off abruptly. Lestrade swore under his breath. "What in blazes does that mean?" Holmes exhaled, slowly. "It means, Lestrade, that Lord Ashcombe knew his death was coming." "Knave?" Before anyone could respond, a sharp knock at the study door interrupted us. A footman entered hesitantly. "Begging your pardon, sirs," he said nervously, "but Mr. Reginald Ashcombe insists he must speak with you at once." Holmes turned to me with an unreadable expression. "And now, Watson, let us see if the heir to Ashcombe Manor is truly a grieving nephew, or something far more dangerous. The secret clue. Reginald Ashcombe entered the study with an air of barely contained agitation. He was a man in his early 30s, dressed impeccably in mourning attire, though his manner suggested more impatience than grief. His sharp features were marred by a nervous energy, his fingers twitching at his sides as he regarded us. "I demand to know what is being done," he declared, his voice taut. "My uncle is dead, and I will not stand idly by while his murder goes unsolved." Holmes studied him with an unreadable expression. his keen gaze taking in every detail. Reginald's slightly dishevelled cuffs, the faint scent of tobacco clinging to his jacket, the tension in his jaw. "You were the one who found the body?" Holmes asked, his voice deceptively mild. Reginald shook his head. "No, it was the butler Grayson who first discovered him. I arrived shortly after when I heard the commotion." "And where were you prior to that?" "In my chambers, writing correspondence. The hour was late, and I had no reason to disturb my uncle." Holmes nodded absent-mindedly, already turning back to the desk. "Tell me, Mr. Ashcombe, was your uncle a superstitious man?" Reginald frowned. "Not in the least. He was a man of reason, highly sceptical of anything not grounded in logic." Holmes ran a thoughtful finger along the edge of the desk. "And yet," he murmured, "his final written words suggest quite the opposite." Reginald's brow furrowed. "Final words?" Holmes gestured to the faintly revealed message on the paper. Reginald stepped closer, eyes narrowing as he read the ghostly indentation of his uncle's unfinished warning. His face paled slightly. I don't understand," he stammered. "What could he have meant?" "That, Mr. Ashcombe, is precisely what I intend to find out," Holmes replied coolly. At that moment, the study door opened again, and the butler, Grayson, stepped in. He was an elderly man with a stoic countenance, his posture straight despite his years of service. His gloved hands were clasped before him as he addressed us with practised formality. "I beg your pardon, gentlemen," he said, his voice measured, "but I thought it prudent to inform you of something unusual." Holmes turned to him with interest. "Unusual, you say?" Grayson hesitated, glancing briefly at Reginald, before continuing. "Earlier this evening, before retiring for the night, Lord Ashcombe instructed me to ensure all the windows and doors were locked. He was unusually insistent about it." Lestrade scoffed. "Given the circumstances, I'd say he had good reason." Grayson nodded, but did not seem reassured. "Indeed, sir. However, what troubles me is this. When I checked his study just now, I found the window latch unfastened." A sudden hush fell over the room. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "The window was unlatched?" "Yes, sir. I know for certain that I secured it earlier in the evening, yet now it stands open, as if someone or something entered through it." Reginald let out a nervous laugh. "Surely you don't mean to suggest my uncle was slain by some phantom, creeping through the window in the dead of night?" Holmes ignored him, moving swiftly to the window. He pushed it open fully, peering out into the darkness beyond. The thick London fog obscured much of the view, but his gaze dropped downward. "Watson, a lantern," he ordered. I retrieved a lamp from the desk and brought it to his side. Holmes leaned forward, angling the light downward over the ledge. A satisfied gleam flickered in his eyes. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked. He straightened, dusting his hands. "Something that should not be here." Lestrade moved forward impatiently. "Well, don't keep us in suspense, man. What is it?" Holmes turned to us, his expression cool but triumphant. "A footprint, Lestrade. A footprint," I repeated. "Indeed," Holmes murmured, "and not just any footprint. Print too large for any of the household staff, yet marked by a peculiar tread, unlike any common boot found in London." Reginald shifted uncomfortably. But that's impossible. My uncle's study is on the second floor. No one could have climbed up to the window." Holmes smiled faintly. And yet someone did. The revelation sent a chill through the room. "Gentlemen," Holmes declared, stepping away from the window, "I believe we are no longer dealing with an ordinary murder. There are forces at play here that extend beyond Ashcombe Manor." Lestrade rubbed his temples. "So, you mean to say our killer didn't enter through the locked door, but rather scaled the walls of this house to reach Lord Ashcombe?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "It would seem so, and I intend to find out why." I exchanged a glance with Lestrade, who looked as troubled as I felt. The case had just taken an ominous turn, and for the first time that evening I wondered if Holmes had been right. This was no ordinary crime. Whatever had transpired in that study, it had left Lord Ashcombe dead, and filled his final moments with unspeakable terror. Rising stakes. A heavy silence filled the study as Holmes stepped away from the window, his sharp eyes alight with intrigue. The footprint on the ledge was an impossibility, an enigma that defied logic. And yet there it was, etched into the thin layer of condensation upon the stone. Reginald Ashcombe let out a nervous breath, rubbing his temples. "This is madness. My uncle is dead in a locked room, and now you're telling me that someone climbed the very walls to reach him?" "Not just someone, Mr. Ashcombe," Holmes corrected. "Someone with the ability, the knowledge, and, most importantly, the reason to do so." Lestrade folded his arms. "I'll admit it's a strange detail, but it hardly tells us who that person is." Holmes smirked. "Quite so, Lestrade, which is why we must look elsewhere for our answers." He turned to the butler. "Mr. Grayson, aside from Lord Ashcombe's insistence on locking the house, was there anything else unusual about his behaviour in the days before his death?" Grayson hesitated before answering. "He was preoccupied, sir. More so than usual. He dismissed the staff early most evenings, and spent long hours alone in his study. He also received several letters, though he burned them after reading." "Burned them?" I echoed. "That suggests he feared someone would find them." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "And did you happen to see the sender's name on any of these letters, Mr. Grayson?" The butler shifted uncomfortably. "No, sir, but the envelopes bore a peculiar seal, a black emblem resembling a serpent intertwined with a dagger." A strange hush settled over the room. Holmes's expression did not change, but I, who had known him for years, recognized the way his fingers curled slightly against his coat, the subtle flicker of understanding in his gaze. He knew something. Lestrade, however, scoffed. "More theatrics. A fancy seal means nothing." Holmes ignored him, turning instead to the desk. And yet Lord Ashcombe feared it enough to destroy every trace. Before anyone could respond, a sharp, distant sound echoed through the manor. A crash, followed by the unmistakable shattering of glass. Reginald's eyes widened. "What was that?" Holmes was already moving. "Come, Watson, quickly!" We rushed into the corridor, Lestrade and Reginald close behind. The noise had come from the lower floors, down the grand staircase toward the drawing-room. The house, once steeped in eerie quiet, now hummed with a strange urgency. As we reached the hallway, we were met by a terrified maid, her face pale as milk. "Sir, there's been another! She clutched at her apron, unable to finish. Holmes did not wait. He strode into the drawing-room where the cold air bit at our skin. The source was immediately evident. The large window overlooking the courtyard had been shattered. Jagged shards of glass littered the floor, gleaming like ice in the dim light. The long curtains billowed slightly, disturbed by the breeze, and there, lying motionless near the fireplace, was a man. I rushed forward instinctively, kneeling beside him. He was dressed in plain but well-tailored clothes, his face unfamiliar. But what sent a chill through me was not the identity of the man. Rather, it was the small black emblem clutched in his lifeless hand. The same emblem the butler had described. The serpent and the dagger. Lestrade cursed. "Another one!" Holmes stood over the body, his sharp gaze scanning every inch. "This man was not a victim," he murmured. "He was a messenger." I looked up. A messenger. Holmes knelt, prying open the man's stiff fingers. Inside his palm, concealed beneath the emblem, was a scrap of paper. Unfolding it, he read aloud, "The Society knows. The price has been paid." A heavy silence followed. Holmes stood slowly, tucking the paper into his coat. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, but beneath it lay an unmistakable edge of resolve. This, he said, was not a mere burglary, nor an act of random violence. We are dealing with something far older, far darker than simple murder. Reginald swallowed hard. "You mean—" Holmes turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "I mean, Mr. Ashcombe, that your uncle did not merely stumble into danger. He was ensnared by something far greater than himself." His gaze flickered toward the broken window, as if searching the darkness beyond. "And now," he added, quietly, "we must discover whether it is finished, or if more blood will be spilled before the night is through. Holmes's strategic play." The shattered window gaped like an open wound, the cold night air curling into the drawing-room. Holmes stood motionless, eyes scanning the darkness beyond. The presence of the dead messenger had changed everything. Lestrade knelt beside the body, muttering under his breath, "Another corpse, another mystery. This is getting out of hand, Holmes." Holmes barely acknowledged him. Instead, he turned to Reginald Ashcombe, who still stood near the door, his face pale. "You recognize him, don't you?" Holmes asked. Reginald blinked. "What? No, I've never seen this man before in my life." Holmes exhaled softly, as though disappointed. "A pity. I was hoping you'd make this easier." Reginald stiffened. "You think I'm lying?" Holmes smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Not at all. I merely think you have yet to recall the significance of this moment." Before Reginald could argue, Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, I require your cooperation in something rather unconventional." Lestrade groaned. "Here we go. I need you to declare publicly that you have solved the case." Lestrade nearly dropped his notebook. "Come again." "You will announce that Lord Ashcombe was murdered by an intruder who entered through the window, and that you are now closing the investigation." Reginald's eyes widened. "But that's absurd. You know that's not the truth." Holmes smiled thinly. "Of course, but our unknown adversaries do not know what we know. They are watching, waiting to see if we come too close to the truth. If they believe the investigation is over, they will move more carelessly." Lestrade hesitated, rubbing his chin. "And you think this will draw them out?" Holmes nodded. "Not just them, the true architect of this entire scheme. A secret society does not operate on impulse. It functions in layers. Whoever sent this messenger must believe their mission has succeeded. We will let them believe it. For now." Lestrade exhaled sharply. "Holmes, if this goes wrong—" Holmes clapped him on the shoulder. "If it goes wrong, Lestrade, you may tell Scotland Yard that you were entirely against my plan from the start." Lestrade muttered something under his breath, but relented. "Fine. But what will you be doing while I play along with your trick?" Holmes turned to the broken window. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Hunting," he said. "The bait is set." Holmes wasted no time. While Lestrade carried out the false announcement, Holmes instructed me to gather what little information we had on the secret society. The serpent and dagger emblem was our only concrete lead, but its mere existence suggested a long history lurking beneath the surface of London's underworld. Meanwhile, Holmes set his own trap. That evening, he disguised himself as a weary traveller and took up residence at a nearby inn, keeping a close watch on Ashcombe Manor from a safe distance. He had insisted on working alone, but I knew his habits too well to leave him entirely unattended. I followed at a distance, careful not to be seen. The night passed in tense silence. The streets were empty, the fog thick as soup. But then, as the clock neared midnight, I saw him. A lone figure, wrapped in a long coat, moving toward the manor with practiced stealth. I tensed. Holmes had been right. I moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, my revolver within reach. The figure scaled the outer wall with uncanny precision, climbing as if the stone itself welcomed his hands. Within moments he had reached the same study window where the first footprint had been found. A whisper of movement behind me made me spin. Holmes emerged from the fog, his disguise now discarded. His eyes shone with fierce determination. "There he is, Watson," he murmured. "Our missing link." "What now?" I whispered. Holmes smiled, but his expression was dark. "Now," he said, "we learn the true nature of our enemy." And with that, he stepped forward into the night, ready to spring the trap. The confrontation. The figure moved like a phantom, slipping through the broken study window with practiced ease. Holmes and I remained still in the fog-laden night, watching as our quarry disappeared into the darkness of Ashcombe Manor. Holmes's lips curled into a ghost of a smile. "Fascinating, Watson. Observe the efficiency of movement. This is no common thief. We are dealing with someone trained." I tightened my grip on my revolver. "What's our next move?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his coat and, with the fluid grace of a predator closing in on its prey, began his approach. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. With the care of men accustomed to danger, we slipped inside through the rear entrance of the manor. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of settling wood. A dim gaslight flickered in the corridor, casting long, wavering shadows along the walls. Holmes motioned for me to stop as he tilted his head, listening. A faint sound, nearly imperceptible, reached us. Footsteps. The intruder was moving within the study. Holmes gestured for me to remain by the doorway as he stepped forward, his movements soundless. He reached the threshold of the study and peered inside. I watched as his body tensed slightly, a rare sign of anticipation. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, Holmes stepped into the room. "Good evening," he said, smoothly. The intruder whirled, his face obscured by a dark scarf. His eyes, a sharp, glinting grey, narrowed in alarm. For a fleeting second, neither man moved. Then, like a coiled spring, the intruder lunged. Holmes sidestepped with effortless precision, catching the man's wrist in an iron grip and twisting it sharply. A muffled grunt of pain followed, but the stranger recovered quickly, striking out with surprising agility. I raised my revolver, prepared to intervene, but Holmes's voice cut through the scuffle. "No, Watson, let's not be rude. Our guest has something to tell us." The intruder's movements ceased abruptly. Holmes had drawn a thin blade from his coat, and now held it with the ease of a man well versed in its use. "Very well," the stranger said, his voice smooth yet edged with tension. "You've caught me. What now?" Holmes smiled. "Now, we talk." The shadows unveiled. Holmes motioned for the man to remove his scarf. Slowly, the intruder complied, revealing a gaunt yet striking face, high cheekbones, a thin mouth, and those watchful grey eyes. There was intelligence there, and something else. Fear. "Your name?" Holmes prompted. The man hesitated, then, with a resigned breath, he answered, "Elias Mercer." Holmes nodded. "Mr. Mercer, you have precisely one opportunity to explain why you are lurking in Ashcombe Manor. I suggest you use it wisely." Mercer exhaled through his nose, his gaze flickering toward me before settling on Holmes. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Holmes leaned in slightly. "Try me." A tense silence stretched between them. Then Mercer spoke, his voice a mere whisper. "I came to retrieve something," he admitted. Holmes's eyes darkened. "The serpent and dagger emblem?" Mercer flinched. "So you know." Holmes tapped a finger against his chin. "I know. More than you realize, Mr. Mercer. The question is, how much do you know?" Mercer hesitated again. Then, with a weary sigh, he sank into the nearest chair, rubbing his temples. "I wasn't sent here to kill anyone," he muttered. "That wasn't supposed to happen." Watson and I exchanged glances. Holmes folded his arms. "Then why are you here?" Mercer lifted his gaze. "To erase the last traces of the society." The room seemed to darken at his words. Holmes studied him carefully. "The Society of Shadows." Mercer nodded. "It is dying, Mr. Holmes. The old masters are dead or in hiding. Lord Ashcombe, he was one of them, but he turned against the society. He tried to leave, and for that he was marked." My breath caught. "You mean he was murdered?" Mercer's expression tightened. "He knew he would be. That's why he locked the house. He was trying to delay the inevitable." Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then, in a quiet voice, he asked, "And you? Were you one of them?" Mercer's jaw clenched. "Once, not any more." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Why?" Mercer's voice was barely audible. "Because I didn't want to be a murderer." A long silence followed. Finally, Holmes straightened. "And yet you returned tonight. Why?" Mercer exhaled. Because there's something here. Something the society needs to disappear. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And what, pray tell, would that be? Mercer hesitated. Then, for the first time that night, his mask of calm cracked. "The ledger," he whispered. "The record of every name, every crime, every secret the society has ever buried." I felt my pulse quicken. Holmes merely nodded. "Where is it?" Mercer swallowed. "I don't know, but I know who does." Holmes leaned forward. And who might that be? Mercer's gaze flickered toward the door, toward the corridor, where, moments ago, the butler had stood. "Grayson," Mercer murmured. "The butler." The revelation struck like a thunderclap. Holmes's lips curled into a sharp smile. "Well now," he said, "things just became infinitely more interesting." The truth in the ledger. The name hung in the air like a spectre. Grayson. The butler. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Then Holmes exhaled softly. A sound not of surprise, but of satisfaction. "Of course," he murmured. "It was always Grayson." I stared at him. "Holmes, you suspected the butler?" Holmes gave me a knowing glance. "Consider, Watson, the methodical way the household was managed, the impeccable order despite Lord Ashcombe's paranoia. Grayson was the gatekeeper, the only man who could move freely within these walls without raising suspicion." His voice lowered. "And if Lord Ashcombe possessed the ledger, someone in this house had to be keeping watch over it." Mercer nodded grimly. "If the society wants to cover its tracks, the ledger must be destroyed. And if Grayson had access to it—" Holmes turned on his heel. "Then we must pay Mr. Grayson a visit. A dead man's secret." We moved swiftly. The house was eerily silent, the echoes of our footsteps swallowed by the heavy drapes and thick carpets. At last we reached Grayson's quarters, a modest room at the far end of the corridor, tucked away from the grander chambers of Ashcombe Manor. Holmes didn't bother knocking. He turned the handle and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark. A single oil lamp flickered on a desk cluttered with papers, but the butler was nowhere in sight. Holmes stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the chamber. "He's gone," he murmured, "but he left in a hurry." I glanced around. The bed was unmade, a half-packed suitcase lay open in the corner, and on the desk. "A letter," I said, stepping forward. "Addressed to no one." Holmes plucked the paper from the desk, his sharp eyes scanning the hastily scribbled words. As he read, his expression darkened. "Watson, if you are reading this, then I have miscalculated. You must burn the ledger. The society will not stop until it is erased. Do not trust anyone, not even Holmes." I stiffened. "What in heaven's name?" Holmes let out a quiet chuckle. "Clever," he muttered, "but a poor bluff." Mercer frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes turned the letter in his hands. "Grayson wrote this in a hurry, but not in fear. This is not a warning. It is misdirection." He tossed the letter aside and moved to the wardrobe, running his fingers along the wooden frame. Then, with a swift motion, he pressed against a hidden latch. A soft click. The false panel swung open, and there, wrapped in worn leather and bound, with a thick strap, was the ledger. Mercer inhaled sharply. The Society's record. Endosian D. Holmes lifted the book, his fingers tracing the aged cover. Every crime, every secret, every betrayal. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. This is what men have killed for. I swallowed. What now? Holmes turned to Mercer. Now, Mr. Mercer, you must make a choice. The final decision. Mercer hesitated. What do you mean? Holmes's eyes were unreadable. You told me you left the Society because you refused to be a murderer. But if you truly wish to bring an end to them, then you must decide. Do we destroy this book and erase their history forever, or do we expose the truth? Mercer paled. If this falls into the wrong hands... Holmes nodded. Precisely. Silence stretched between us. Then Mercer reached for the ledger. His fingers hovered over it for a moment before he closed his eyes and exhaled. No more secrets, he said. The world must know. Holmes smiled, just slightly. Then let us ensure that it does. But even as he spoke, a shadow passed the doorway. A figure watching, waiting, and the game was not yet over. The mastermind revealed. A movement at the doorway. A shadow shifting in the dim light. Holmes's head tilted ever so slightly. "We have a visitor," he murmured. In an instant I spun toward the door, revolver drawn. Mercer tensed, his hand hovering near his coat pocket where his own weapon likely lay. But Holmes? He merely smiled. "Come in, Mr. Grayson." A figure stepped forward, his gait steady, his face composed. The butler. His expression betrayed no fear, no hesitation. He shut the door behind him with deliberate care, then clasped his hands in front of him like a man about to deliver a well-rehearsed speech. "You found it," he said, his voice calm. "I expected nothing less." Holmes tapped the ledger in his palm. "Indeed, and I must commend you, Grayson. Few men could have maintained a facade so well for so many years. To think, all this time, you were not merely Ashcombe's servant, but his watcher." I blinked in surprise. Watcher? Grayson exhaled slowly. Lord Ashcombe believed he could escape the Society's reach, but we do not let our own leave so easily. Mercer's eyes darkened. "You were part of it?" Grayson's gaze flicked toward Mercer. "Not merely part of it. I was its caretaker." The words sent a chill through me. Holmes, however, seemed almost amused. "Ah, of course. The butler, a man who sees everything, hears everything, yet remains unnoticed. Who better to ensure the Society's secrets remained buried?" Grayson inclined his head. "You understand, then, why I cannot allow that book to leave this house?" Mercer's grip tightened. "And I suppose you mean to kill us for it?" The butler's lips curved into a thin smile. "Not if you do the logical thing and hand it over." Holmes sighed, stepping forward. "Grayson, Grayson, you disappoint me. A man of your intellect should know better than to assume I ever surrender a game before it's played to its conclusion." Grayson's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. I tensed, recognizing the movement of a man preparing to strike. Holmes saw it too. "Ah, but before you try anything foolish, I should inform you that Scotland Yard is already en route." Grayson's composure wavered for the first time. "You're bluffing!" Holmes smirked. "Am I?" A sound echoed through the house, the distant clatter of boots. Grayson stiffened. "You see," Holmes continued, "while you so generously gave me time to solve this mystery, I took the liberty of arranging a rather large audience for its conclusion. Inspector Lestrade should be arriving any moment now." A flicker of fury crossed Grayson's face. He took a sharp step forward, but Mercer was faster. His revolver was out in an instant. "Don't," Mercer warned. For the first time, the butler hesitated. His gaze flicked between us. The ledger, the door, the weight of the inevitable pressing down on him. Holmes merely smiled. "It appears your society is about to crumble, Mr. Grayson." Footsteps thundered down the hall. Grayson closed his eyes, and then, without another word, he raised his hands in surrender. The shadows fall. Lestrade arrived moments later, his men flooding the room. Grayson was taken into custody without resistance, though he remained eerily silent throughout. Holmes handed the ledger to the inspector. "I believe you'll find this most illuminating," he said. "A full account of the Society's activities. Names, dates, crimes committed in the shadows of power." Lestrade flipped through the pages, his brows raising. This is enough to bring down half of London's elite." Holmes nodded. "Precisely, and that is why it must be handled with utmost care." Mercer, standing to the side, exhaled softly. "It's over," he murmured. Holmes glanced at him, a peculiar glint in his eye. "Is it?" Mercer frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. "The Society of Shadows was built upon secrecy and influence. We have struck a decisive blow, yes, but the question remains, who else still lurks in the dark?" Lestrade scoffed. "Holmes, can't you be satisfied with one victory at a time?" Holmes merely smiled. "Ah, my dear Lestrade, satisfaction is the enemy of progress." I sighed. "And I suppose you're already thinking of our next case." Holmes turned toward the window, watching as the fog rolled over the London streets. "Always, Watson, always."